Boardroom Bound, Episode 56, How to Become a Finance Expert on a Board with Kevin Rauckman.
It's unfortunate. I think almost every company would say, integrity might be one of their core values, but how they actually operate day to day is often different. You have to really, you're aligning your own personal values with the organization and the culture of the board that you might be joining is really critical.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give new and aspiring directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder that you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. In today's show, we'll be doing a deep dive into the financial world of the board roles. We'll be talking with Kevin Rauckman. Kevin currently serves as the Executive Director of the Kansas City Fellows Program, a leadership development initiative for recent college graduates. At the end of 2014, he retired as the CFO and Treasurer of Garmin after serving that capacity for 16 years. His primary accomplishments at Garmin included an IPO while teaming with the founders of the company, serving during a sustained period of high growth within the technology sector, working with analysts and shareholders on Wall Street, acquiring over 30 companies during his tenure, building and coaching a global team of finance professionals, overseeing all the facility expansions needed at Garmin, and managing a treasury function that included billions in assets. So in today's show, we're going to hear about Kevin's career changing from being an executive as the CFO in the C-suite to transitioning to the non-executive, to being a board director. Now, Kevin's ultimate goal is to get a public company board role. He's not there yet, but he's progressed considerably along that way. We're going to hear about that journey. So he's already on 7 company boards today. 2 of them are private, massive, multi-billion-dollar companies. 3 of them are startup private equity type opportunities, and 2 are large nonprofits. So he has a professional portfolio, which are help positioning him for that one public company board role. He'd be clear he's only got so much time left, so he only wants one of those. And we're going to hear about his experience in the transition, his brand, his expertise. Kevin and I will share equal information back and forth from our similar experience as finance experts and what that looks like for the boards that we serve on. So excited to use this as an opportunity to give you a deep dive look and background of if you were a finance expert, what would that look like in comparison to the board opportunities you should be seeking. So let's jump into the show. Kevin Rauckman, delighted to have you on the Boardroom Bound podcast today.
Thanks so much, Alexander.
It is great to have you today. For our listeners, we love to have people that have been in the trenches, have understood what's going on, and are on their journey. And yours is, as we were joking about before we came here, in many ways far down the path, but still looking for that public company board role. But your experience from having been in the boardroom both as an executive and non-executive will be useful, and we can also do a deep dive for what it's like for someone who's a deep finance subject matter expert, because as we've talked about in many of our previous episodes, it's about being something that's a unique brand, what you're known for, that actually gets you into the role. So much for us to unpack today.
Yeah, really looking forward to the conversation.
And I would love if we could just start out a little bit of your fascinating background from before, back when you were in the ranks of the executive suite, what that looked like for you. I know you were about 16 years working as the treasurer and CFO, but maybe you can unpack that a little bit for us.
Yeah, so I have about a 30-year background primarily in financial. In the last 16 years, as you mentioned, I was the CFO and treasurer of Garmin Limited, which is a large global business in a wide variety of industries. And I had a lot of different hats, which was fun and also quite daunting at times. But I was primarily leading a team of finance and accounting professionals around the world, but I also had investor relations as part of my responsibility. Presented a lot of information to the Garmin board as the executive with finance background, and there's a wide variety of other things as well. But those were kind of the 3 or 4 aspects of my job that were part of my life the last 16 years before I transitioned.
And before we get to the transition, and I definitely want to spend a lot of time on that, I would love to hear from, deep financial expertise is a knowledge. You've got the SEC Financial Expert badge. What was it like for you in the boardroom being the executive?
Yeah, so we had, we actually, when I was the CFO in the mid 2000s, I also went through a transition into this thing called Sarbanes-Oxley, which totally changed the way we handled internal control. So while I was the CFO and had to make sure the financial statements were in order every quarter before we announced earnings, I also had to sign off with our CEO in terms of a solid financial control system. So there was quite a bit of work that went on there. And then, of course, we were dealing with things like acquisitions and other technology transitions during the year, because it was primarily a technology business that I worked at. So there's a lot of different things that we addressed at the board level, and myself and my team put most of that material together. Even things like taxes, which were complicated, but the tax strategy around a business.
And I imagine one of the challenges, and I'd love to talk about your transition from executive to the boardroom. Imagine one of the challenges, you go from being someone who's got your fingers in everything because you're responsible for looking after all of it to suddenly having to pull back and come with a different perspective.
Yeah, you're talking about moving out of the executive role?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. I basically woke up one morning in my early 50s and felt like God was kind of calling me into a different direction, and felt like, there wasn't as much that I needed to do anymore, that I'd created a lot of different pieces of the business, and felt like just kind of moving in a totally different direction. And one of the directors that I had at Garmin, I can't name names obviously, but he had actually encouraged me, and maybe it was because he wanted to get rid of me, I don't know, but he encouraged me to consider board work. And so I started thinking about that, realizing that could very well be something I could do in my older years. But I also had worked with people that when they were retiring, if you want to use that word, I don't like to use it, but when they retire in their 60s and sometimes even later, they weren't able to do what they wanted to because of health reasons. So I felt like, why wait till my mid to late 60s to make a transition? Do it when I still felt young and healthy, and could offer some different perspective at the board.
And so I would love to hear from, maybe we can talk a bit about what it was like, the topics and the sort of information you went through. Think about the boardroom first when you were in the CFO role, and then maybe we can transition to that perspective from where you are now.
Yeah, so we really went through, at Garmin in particular, we went through business strategy. We spent quite a bit of time on new product announcements and a product roadmap in the tech sector. And we, as I mentioned earlier, dealing with financials, dealing with acquisitions, a lot around tax strategies, because we were a global business in about 50 countries, 50 plus countries. So we were looking at the best overall corporate structure. Of course, we had to deal with governance, just like any other board has to. So we were looking at things like I mentioned, Sarbanes-Oxley, but also environmental governance, and even the stock plans that we had. So there was the typical challenges that a board has, compensation, those kind of things. And go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I remember back to one of my board roles, the company had about 60 international names of holding companies, tax structures around the world. And it was always just so complicated, just trying to keep it straight. Which variation of the name are we talking about for which jurisdiction, and how do we make the right decisions here? It was often a head scratching exercise.
Yeah, that's exactly what we had. And when I first started at that company, we had about 3 legal entities, and we had 55 or something like that, 55 legal entities when I left 16 years later. So had a team of people that really helped me do that. And we bring in experts, and we used outside third parties like KPMG and Ernst & Young to advise us on some of these pretty complicated matters around where best to be structured and how to have the most efficient corporate organizational structure to pay the right amount of taxes, but not pay too many taxes. And most of it was often tax related. And then, of course, if you acquire companies, then that adds a whole nother level of complexity in how do they fit into your existing structure? Do you have to create a new legal entity, or sometimes multiple legal entities? So yeah, we got into all of that at the board level.
Right. I remember feeling like whenever we had a merger and acquisition, there was just what you talked about where does it fit in, but also we might be phasing it over time. So it's going to morph from what it was that we bought it today until we get it to where we want it in the future and how we fit it in. But through that period, it's going to be an intense process of figuring out what the right way to do and to change over time, because it doesn't switch at a dime when you buy the company.
Absolutely. And we had intellectual property and intangible assets that we purchased. We had people. Of course, there was big cultural issues that you had to address when you try to integrate a company into a massive global business. So yeah, there was all of those things that may have made sense at one point in time, but if you look 5 years down the road, you had to anticipate, what is the appropriate structure and kind of the organization look like as you move forward in time.
Especially when we're in a time period, especially think about Starbucks, how the world was changing so quickly. What were the new rules going to be? No one quite knew, so you're making the best judgment you can. You're probably going to have to change some of that as you get further down, but I think that's where the business strategy is so exciting. So I remember we would have some of the same smart advisors that you talked about, some of the big name firms there guiding us. They're giving similar ideas to other companies as well, and you're trying to figure out what's the appropriate stuff for your company to implement, and especially for you, where you probably had a headquarters in the U.S. and a headquarters in Europe, right? So you have different types of cultural decisions being made.
Absolutely. And then we had Asia, and then we moved into Latin America. So really we're around most of the regions all around the world, but absolutely we started Garmin with an Asian holding company, and then when we went public in the year 2000, we actually created an offshore holding company, and then over time moved it into Switzerland. And the Switzerland transition to a holding company made a lot of sense as we were expanding our European presence. So all of those things were moving pieces through the years, which I felt like made the boardroom and the executive team and overall business really exciting, actually pretty fun, that there was unending number of issues to deal with.
Well, I'm sure going through the IPO was in many ways a headache, but also incredibly exciting. And for many people, the ultimate goal would be a director of a public company board role. So I'm imagining being the CFO of someone who took a company public and then managed it makes that transition a lot easier for you for the future.
Yeah, I didn't anticipate what that would mean at the time. So in the year 2000, I was able to, it was one of the kind of highlights of my own personal career, do the IPO with the two founders of the company, original founders of the company, and just traveling all over the world in about a 2-week period to sell on the roadshow, sell the company, and then learning later on just as an SEC financial expert, which is what I'm basically known as, what kind of a role that could mean in terms of board presence. And it actually has been pretty fun to be able to transition from an executive level into a board level. And again, I'm not on any public companies yet, but at some point, I think in the future, I would qualify and be able to meet the needs of certain organizations there.
Well, that term SEC financial expert in American public companies is incredibly important when you think about it. It's something you have to report to the government, to the SEC, of do you have someone on your audit committee that meets that need? So, of course, every company wants to have at least one. And the original version of Sarbanes-Oxley was basically going to say you pretty much had to be a retired partner for one of the big companies to meet that need because existing partners had too many conflicts. It was a very small universe. So they've changed that now to basically say if you had the equivalent experience analyzing these sorts of companies and these sorts of statements, then you're okay to go. And that's a very important stamp. So I'm sure the ranks of the people who can say they have that qualification will continue to grow. But for yourself, we've talked about on this show in previous episodes, what is your unique brand proposition? That must be an instrumental part of it. Is that how you think about that term?
I think I do because often you'll see retired Big Four audit partners that would fit that, but because of my experience in the executive ranks, I definitely fit that, and I think I bring a more unique skill set because of the ability to manage a global business around not only financial but also strategic issues. So we were dealing with things like enterprise risk and cybersecurity, and how do you deal with compensation and like I mentioned earlier, stock plans in a business, and competitive threats, and even business culture, which is often thought of as more of a HR or other expert. We got into all of those things in the boardroom as I was the CFO of the company.
Well, I think there's no question today that that is best practice. On one of the firms, when I first started as a board member, it was never talked about. It was never deemed worthy of the little time that we had for the board to be talking about it. But given all the headlines we see today about the various scandals that are plaguing some major companies, I don't know how boards wouldn't be worried about that.
I think you're absolutely right. I think it's unfortunate. I think if a business really operates with a high degree of integrity, I think almost every company would say, integrity might be one of their core values, but how they actually operate day to day is often different. So I think you have to, especially with the risks that are possible in any organization, you have to really, I think this would be one of my points I would make to anybody who's listening. You're aligning your own personal values with the organization and the culture of the board that you might be joining is really critical.
And we've talked about that in previous episodes about cultural fit is essential for yourself to be successful with the board. You want to believe in the brand, you want to believe in the company's mission, but also believe in the way that the other board members are working. And I wonder from the time that you were there in the CFO working the board, whether you saw some of those dynamics at play.
Yeah, I've been pretty fortunate to be able to work alongside some really incredible people. But it often, I think that what I've told friends of mine and colleagues now that I'm not in the executive C-suite anymore, I say I get to choose who I get to serve with on boards and also in other business propositions. So I have a feeling that when you're an executive, you don't always get to choose who are your other executives, who else is on the board. But if I want to choose the boards that I feel really comfortable with the organization, the culture, and the people. So I want to hang out with the people that I feel really comfortable with. I don't want it because that really does impact your personal brand. If you're affiliated with someone that isn't operating with integrity and with a similar personal value, that can be problematic.
I would agree. I remember my first board opportunity. I was so eager to have one. I didn't really worry about those sorts of issues and no problems emerged. But having had several now and been through those experiences, I realized I want to interview them as much as they want to interview me. I want to make sure it's a good fit to go out there. And I would love to hear part of your transition from being in the C-suite to being on the other side. And maybe you can also break down for the audience now the types of portfolio you have as a board member, the different types of companies, but how you actually go about that process where you're doing the interviewing to make sure you're getting into a place that's a good fit for you.
Yeah, I am right now on 7 different boards, and as I said, none of them are public. So I have a wide variety. Well, maybe not wide, but at least a variety. I have 2 large companies that are multi-billion dollars in size. One's from a construction industry, and one is in financial services. Then I also have 3 boards that are really more early stage to startup type businesses and private equity. So while I'm the shareholder and owner of the stock, I'm also on their board in a more of an advisory role. So while we still have a formal board, a lot of it is dealing with advising the CEO and their top lieutenant to how to move forward into that kind of early stage company. And then the last 2 are on actually nonprofits, which I kind of joke often take as much or more time as the for-profit.
Well, certainly depending on the moment that you're in, right? Whether it's perhaps in the middle of a merger and acquisition or a CEO change, whatever it might be, any one of the boards could need a lot of help at one moment.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, even last year after at the end of the year in 2018, I went and analyzed, okay, where did I spend my time last year? And how many hours did I put into each board? It seemed like, and it was actually pretty interesting when I went, one board didn't take nearly as much time as another. And it was helpful to me to see, okay, how much capacity or bandwidth do I have moving forward if I wanted to join one more? So not only the people, but also the time commitment before I said yes to anything.
And in terms of how you've gone about finding these opportunities, I know you and I have talked offline before about that you would like to build a portfolio and how they come together. Did these find you because of your, say, brand as SEC Financial Expert? Did you go out and hunt these down? How did you go about it?
Well, it was pretty interesting. I thought I would have to go hunt them down, and maybe that's why I haven't been asked to be on a public company yet, because I haven't done any kind of real searches. I've had friends that have told me about different board opportunities. And so the networking, I'm not your typical, I don't know if there is a typical CFO anymore, but I'm not a typical CFO. I'm just closing the books and analyzing numbers and maybe doing a little bit more strategic thinking. But I also really like people. I love being around people a lot. So I had a lot of connections and networks, not only in the Midwest, which is where I live, but also on the coast, in both San Francisco, New York, Boston, and those kind of places. So I did have friends. And so occasionally people would point out, hey, have you thought about this? This is a board opportunity. You might want to check it out. And so it was really more about networking, but it was not something that I went out and sought.
Which makes sense, right? So your brand preceded you because you had people who were vouching for your quality, able to make introductions for you. If you were to take the next step and say, I want to pursue a public company board and go out there, how would you proceed? Do you need to take your brand to a certain level? How would you plan to go about it? What would you think?
I would likely go look at the industries that I'm interested in, and what, for example, two of the private equity and smaller companies that I'm involved with are software as a service, and I feel like that's an area that I have some expertise in. So I'd likely just go do some analysis around that industry or another industry like that and say, who's out there? Who could I work with? And then do I know anybody who can connect me to those organizations? So that's likely what I'll do next, is just to do a little bit more research in a variety of industries to see which companies might be open to bringing on someone with that needs a financial expert. And that's the other thing, is timing is really critical.
Mm-hmm.
You have a board member that might be maybe the audit committee chairman, for example, which is what I am on two of the boards. So I'm an audit committee chair that leads that committee for the board. Those positions don't come up and open very frequently. So you just have to kind of be aware of what's out there, even looking at the age and the transition of some existing boards.
That's right. And would you describe yourself now that I guess you're a professional portfolio board member? Is that how you think about it? Or are these sort of in addition to, I know what you do is the day job running that great leadership and education group, the Kansas City Fellows. How do you describe it to someone?
Yeah, I try not to put a label. I'm not a big person on label, but I mean, I'm clearly a CFO, financial expert, but I'm also working on mentoring and leadership with this Kansas City Fellows program. So it's kind of both. I'm doing two different distinct roles with board leadership and also mentoring and coaching and leading the next generation of leaders.
I like that. Now, Kevin, when you think about board members and people that are perhaps aspiring to do what you do, as professional portfolio role, and even though we just described that's only part of it, do you feel like there are one or two essential skills that someone has to go about developing?
Well, I think from my perspective, I can only speak from what I've done, and that is having really solid experience in the C-suite often is a much easier way to get into the board. So if you're a CEO and a CFO, I think you have a natural advantage.
Mm-hmm.
But the other things I think are soft skills like communication and being able to collaborate and also think strategically, because so much of what a board does isn't so much operational and day-to-day, but it's much more strategic thinking. So those are a few things I would say. If a prospective board member has those in their toolkit, I think that could be helpful. Other things that I've seen from really good board members is their ability to make hard decisions. So, you get into a position on boards where it's not always black and white. It's not always cut and dry. In fact, there might even be disagreement between the board members. So I think that's another component that can make a board member more valuable to the organization.
I would agree with that. Yeah.
I was going to say maybe a few others. You're really not an individual at the board level. You're a team player. So if you're team oriented, people often say they're team oriented, but when push comes to shove, are you really team oriented? Are you able to work with others that may disagree with you? And I think the other thing that I've learned is, and this is only 4 years of experience, you're never too old or you're never past learning. So there's a high degree of learning that goes on even once you're a board member. So you've got to kind of keep your fingers in the pulse of what's going on in the industry that your company is in on the board.
And I think that's probably underappreciated by some people. So like you, I hang my hat on the financial services background, the fintech experience, and a company might bring you in for that expertise. You might be in an entirely different industry than you're used to. There's a massive learning curve that you've got to get up and be able to speak to. Then you're trying to stay abreast of the news and understand how that impacts your business. And that might be in lots of different implications. Could be tax changes, government reform, whatever it might be. And that takes a lot of time. So that's a lot of time outside the board meeting as well. How much are you spending between board meetings preparing in activities like that?
Well, if you think about the number of hours a board takes in a formal setting, whether it's a committee or whether it's a board, it's really not that much. So a vast majority of the hours that I spend on a board are in reading materials. So we typically have a board portal that has all the materials posted up to that. Well, that could be hours just in advance of a board meeting. And then there's additional, one-on-one conversations with a variety of experts. So I'd say, seriously, a large degree, well over 50% is spent outside the board in terms of the time of a board member. So that's been my experience. And some take a lot of time and others are much more efficient. It just depends on the industry and the company.
Right. And I remember leading the investment committee for a large pension that I was on, and we were going through a massive change. We were going to go to the OCIO route and outsource our decision making to someone else who could be faster and more strategic and tactical at the same time than we were. And a lot of the activity between the board meetings I was doing was stakeholder management. I was going around having the conversations with my fellow board members, getting the temperature check, helping them explain why we were going through this process. I never wanted to get into the meeting having to take a vote and a decision and be surprised by the answers. I would like to know where I stood and be able to address people's opportunities and questions in advance.
Yeah, that was a big part of it as well with my experience. And another aspect that I didn't mention was even setting an agenda. So some boards become very rote, become very consistent every quarter. In January, you're going to do these 5 things. In April, you're going to do these 7 things. And, you have a kind of a consistent schedule. In fact, we've even, in a couple of my boards, we put in a matrix of when are we going to address each of the key aspects. But then you also have to be willing to shake it up depending on business conditions. So, hey, board member George, what are we going to talk about next agenda? Do we need to add 1 or 2 items that are problematic or things that we need to address and resolve? So setting an agenda is a really key part of being on a board.
And I think people probably don't necessarily always anticipate the differences for the chair and how much extra work they have to be ready for the rest of that board to be run successfully, like the way you've articulated there.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not a chair on any of the boards, but I work with the chair to say, hey, these are the 2 or 3 things we need to be addressing. If you're going to be setting the agenda, please keep these in mind as we go forward. So it's, as you mentioned, Alexander, it's these ad hoc conversations that go on outside. And then maybe one other thing that I think I saw when I was at Garmin and I've seen in some of the other boards, and that is not just the formal meetings we've had, but also the informal meetings that the directors have. So we often will have a board dinner the night before. We'll actually have a board meeting, and maybe some of your other guests have said this on the podcast, but I find that the dinner where you're sitting around a table having a casual conversation can be a really key part, a very strong part of helping the board be effective in how they communicate and make decisions.
Oh, invaluable. I know for myself, when you're joining a board and the other group has been together for whatever period of time, probably years, and you're the newcomer, you need those chances to have conversations. These are probably people flying in from all across the country, if not different parts of the world, and you need to build that rapport and that relationship very quickly. That was invaluable to me. And I also found I really like the practice of having an executive session at the beginning and end of a board meeting, so whatever needs to be said can be said before people disappear. Again, those times to be frank and clear and honest with each other, I think, are really useful.
Yeah, and I've just personally gone through that myself, having just joined a few boards that I'm the new guy. So one in particular, one board is a company that's been around 100 years. They've been around quite a bit. So they all kind of knew each other. I'm the new guy, new kid on the block. So it's more about how can I help? How can I get to know you all personally, and then how can I help as we move forward? So, but I do agree with you on the executive session too. It's just that real frank conversation around what's going on in the business, and while we like to do have those conversations with executive team, sometimes you have to have those from an independent director have additional conversations without management there.
Right. And Kevin, I wonder if there are any nuggets for our audience. You just talked about being the new guy on a board, the learning curve, getting up to speed. Do you have any takeaways here that are practical advice for someone as you're getting ready to take that first board role? This is what you should really do. We've talked about the conversations at the dinners. Anything else come to mind?
Well, I think, I was, I guess because I was essentially not on a board, but operated on a board for 16 years, I'd had many conversations with the Garmin board members before. So I asked a lot of questions ahead of time. But I think if you can even somehow get in with one or two people that are on boards and say, okay, tell me your experience, just to have a coffee or dinner or whatever, just to have that conversation ahead, just to kind of anticipate what could be some of the other issues. And then there's a lot of resources. So I mentioned a couple of the big four companies earlier. They have done a good job of bringing additional resources to bear to those people that are on boards, whether it's a public company or private company. So there's a large number of books and articles around what are the kind of the emerging trends around boards of directors. So those are the things that I did. I met people individually and then also did quite a bit of reading in the background.
And as we begin to wrap this up, as I think about tying it back together, we talked at the very beginning about lots of change, right? So Sarbanes-Oxley, massive change for both the CFO and a board. You think about fiduciary responsibilities. As you begin to think about your future, clearly a public company board, I'm sure that will happen at some time soon for you. Do you anticipate any future changes in the boardroom that you're going to have to be aware of as a board member?
Well, I think the largest one, and you'll read a lot about this, or many people are already reading about this, is the kind of the disruptive risks that are available or possible at a company, and also cybersecurity. So those are two of the kind of the hot buttons right now that we're addressing on a couple of different companies. And what is it really going to take to minimize those as a business moves forward? So I think the corporate governance, I believe, is always going to be there. The financial forecasting and the trends and how the macroeconomic environment impacts that, those are always going to be there. But some of these kind of more emerging areas where it's really difficult to kind of get your hands around them, like cyber, for example, those are a couple of areas that I think I need to mention.
And risk is something that I spent about a dozen years working in, and I feel like it never gets enough time. Now, granted, I'm biased in that perspective because I worked in it for so long, but it is so easy to take your eye off the ball. The difference between the risk and the issue is once it becomes real. So I think that boards are served well by paying attention to. You can never anticipate everything, but the more you can be prepared for, the easier life will be for everybody in the company.
Yeah, I agree 100%.
Well, Kevin, I am so grateful for you joining us today and being a part of the Boardroom Bound podcast. I'm sure some of our audience would want to follow up with you or understand more about your history, perhaps even become the company that offers you that public company board role. How would you like people to be following up with you?
Well, I'm not a big social media guy, but LinkedIn is the primary way that I would say you can connect with me there. So I'm on LinkedIn, and that's the one area that I often will connect with people.
Okay. Well, I'll make sure we put that in the show notes. And we were delighted to have you on the podcast today. And I'd love to thank you for sharing your insights and helping everybody in our audience be more boardroom bound.
Thank you so much, Alexander. It's been a lot of fun.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Kevin Rauckman. I love that we've begun a series of deep dives for you into the different components of a board composition matrix. Imagine there's different skill sets that people are after, and great honest feedback from Kevin from serving as a CFO in the executive to now in a board position being the non-executive, what that looks like, the different skill sets, his transition. Now remember to head over to podcast.gordon.edu where you can get all the links from today's resources. And if you enjoyed this episode, I'd encourage you to take 30 seconds to leave a review on iTunes. These are the best way that we get word out about this podcast. So thanks for joining me on this episode of the show. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.